The first time I went to Cannes, I was sleeping on a fold-out couch, but I had to buy my first tux because you can't rent them for 2 weeks. But you just go to the places, and we were just having a good time. And after my first Cannes, from a woman I met from Australia, a company from Canada, and a guy from New York, I ended up raising $400,000 2 months later, which became my first Sundance film. But you got to, you got to show up.
I think sometimes in film industry, when we talk about filmmaking and festivals and distribution and sales, like all these things are very siloed, and it's like, well, you finish one and then suddenly like the next door opens and it's a complete mystery. And I love that we're here and we're all going to talk about all the different pieces, because I think more and more they start to blend together. And I also think that especially when it comes to distribution, there's a lot of doom and gloom. So I think we'll address the doom and gloom, but hopefully we can also have some constructive ideas of what the next steps could look like. And so I think also when we talk about filmmaking generally, we often like to reference a rosier past of when things were better, when money was easier, let's say. And I wonder if maybe that's a jumping off point for today, is talking about for each of you, in the past 5 years, what are some things from all of your different perspectives that have changed the most? You don't have to go in order. You can.
Well, I guess I'll jump in and say that, obviously 5 years ago was a pre-pandemic year, and so there was sort of this general rise in interest I primarily focus on selling documentaries. There's a growing interest in documentaries and bigger topics, bigger stars, and sort of the growth of like the mega documentary. And then when the pandemic came, things shifted, and we sort of thought it's all gonna sort of drain away, and then it actually got more heated. And I think it sort of led to a situation that we're in now, where there was a little more of a heated like dynamic of like finding films that would help build up the viewership of these streamers, and I think they weren't worried about the money and the metrics of whether or not these were profitable. And now we're getting into a newer zone, I think, which contributes to the challenging nature of the market now, which is that they're more like realizing that the giant amounts that they paid for some of the documentaries, and not just documentaries, of course, it's also narratives. We just happen to focus a bit more on that side. But there's sort of a leveling out, and also in that period, a lot of the streamers started commissioning films from the filmmakers that would independently finance their films and bring them to sales agents and go through the festival route. And sometimes that would, those commissioned films would skip that whole thing and just premiere on the streamer. And so it became a different dynamic where there's just less demand, less slots, and I think it's part of what I see now as a more challenging market, much more than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, five, 6 years ago, this is where it's hard not to be the doom and gloom. But the good news is it's easier than ever to make a film. But then to get meaningful distribution and all that, it's easy for me to kind of talk about Assassination Nation, and we sold for over 10 million at Sundance in 2018. But even I've had 3 films at Sundance. 2 of my other 3 films at Sundance are on an ROI basis my least successful films. So it's like, from the beginning, I think, understanding that with the marketplace shifting, 6 of my 10 films before I started at Marginal sold for MG's minimum guarantees higher than the budget. And that's a lot harder to pull off now. In our last 2 films, like She Taught Love, we knew was going to Hulu. We did a horror comedy that's going to Tubi. I think Tubi's a great space for emerging indie filmmakers. I know it's a lot different than a lot of people, they think about the Steven Soderbergh stories and going up the mountain, in Park City. But I don't want to discourage anyone from making it, but understand the why and the who, make it a little bit easier for Josh and Ania and the people down the line to find a place in this marketplace. I used to get really angry with the passes we would get but now being an executive for the last 3 years versus just a pure indie filmmaker, it's like, oh, with all these consolidation, at the end of the day, they're a person that's trying not to lose their job too. And I'm a little bit more empathetic towards that. So what can I do to make it a little bit easier for them to say yes?
Are we doing in order? Okay, and then I'll go.
Any
I
direction.
guess, I have to say, so I've been at Sundance for 5 years, and every year felt different, because I think of all the changes within the industry, but also the changes in the world and how that affects curation, how that affects what you guys make as filmmakers too, and how we respond to that as a festival. So I feel like I'm on that journey of constantly learning and trying to expose myself to as much change as possible, even if it's scary at times, because it is, and it's not always good. And we had to, the whole world, like in terms of pivoting and that horrible world, to pivot at some point. We kept pivoting, and it was horrible, and it wasn't what we wanted, because we wanted to be in person at the festival in Park City, and we had to do other things. And we made it work mostly because we just really were concentrating on making it a good experience for filmmakers, or as good as possible at that time. So I think I definitely learned that you have to be flexible. I also learned that no one has the answers. If people tell you they do, don't believe them, because it's just opinions basically, and it's, it might have worked for someone, it might not work for you. So it's almost just, to me, it's obvious that you have to do your research, and you have to figure out, to Milan's point, who is your film for, and what would you want it to do? Like, what does success mean for you? And that goes for us too on the other end. Like, how do we see successful curation? And all of that is, I think, is affected by the changes that you mentioned in terms of who buys what, and we have to find balance in that. But I think it's just almost like you're being true to yourself. That is the thing that I guess I learned, that it matters to me to see people in one room watching a film. It really does, and it changes everything. And it's meaningful to be able to do that. So I think festivals, yes, everyone is in trouble one way or another, but on the other hand, to have that moment of gathering people in one place to watch something that means a lot to people is great, and it works. So to me, that is something that I wish, for us to do for as long as we can.
It's hard for me to know exactly where we are now, to be really honest, in terms of as a writer and director that has to produce his own films. My first film was a co-production between France, Germany, Colombia, and Peru. And at that time, this Colombian company was just starting, and Colombia had just approved a lot of great laws for investment. And so they actually created a fund, which was new in Latin America, a company with actually money to put in to films. And my film was financed by part of that money, and it was great. And we were able to access, cultural funding from France, from Germany. And then little by little, that Colombian company doesn't have that fund anymore, because streamers started to become really huge and so what they do now is they actually do production services for Netflix in Colombia, and they're doing, for example, now, the company is called Dynamo, and they're doing 100 Years of Solitude. And so I actually started working in streaming, and that felt like, okay, this is the new wave. But then the golden era of that streaming, at least in Latin America, has dwindled a little. So I think we're at a point, I don't want to be a gloom, but we're at a point in which it's hard to know exactly what is the new thing now, and hopefully it will be a mix of both, and hopefully it will be easy to do co-productions again, in terms of, at least outside of the US, and hopefully for the US too. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
It does.
It makes a lot of sense, and I agree with a lot of it. Working in Lebanon and the Arab world, what I learned is that everything changes so fast. Every time we adapt to something, we have to adapt to something else. So this is in life, but also in the film industry. So for example, when I started working in film, the main goal was to get the film accepted in a big film festival internationally, and that would allow the film to get international distribution, and it would flow naturally everywhere in the world, get bought by distributors distributors, etc. The more we progressed, then the festival was still important, but it wouldn't give as much visibility, like distribution became harder, but the film could be screened in festivals and still reach an audience. And in the Arab world, in the beginning, like the value of the Arab countries as a territory was not much because these films would not get bought or like had no commercial value in the Middle East. But that actually changed, and there were suddenly platforms, not only Netflix, but also Arab one that developed, and even television broadcasters, like regional one that started acquiring, and suddenly the value of Arab films was higher in the territory, sometimes higher than internationally, which was not the case before for independent cinema. And now, like Javier said, it became like, I think streamers realized that independent cinema is not really what attracts bigger audiences, so they're going through more commercial, for more commercial films. So they stopped buying more independent films, and festivals have become not a guarantee for distribution. So we're kind of in a place where we make our films. We try to get them outside through festivals, but it's a lot of work also behind that. Like they don't naturally flow anymore, and each film you have to evaluate its potential, who's the audience it can reach, etc., which make my work as a producer like much harder, because I cannot stop when a film is done and like move to my other film in production, but I really need to spend a lot of time with the film to make sure this film we spent making for 4 years, this is the least amount of time we spend making a feature film, sometimes 10 years, that it doesn't get, a very, very limited audience.
I think that's such a good point, and we're going to return to that later. I have a two-part question for the filmmaking side for Myriam, Javier, and Milan. The first part of this is, what are you hearing from the funding side in terms of like actually getting films and projects made? Like, are you also getting hesitation from funders that used to give more freely? Are they giving you instructions of, what sort of films and stories that they want told? So that was the first part of the question. And then secondly, to what you just said of like, the ideal used to be you had a film and you played it at a notable film festival, and that would bring global visibility and then lead to global distribution. And I was actually looking at your filmography before this, and you have that. I was looking at Costa, Brava, Lebanon, and what did you premiere at TIFF?
Venice, then TIFF.
Venice, then TIFF. The best you could have. And you did get US distribution. So I wonder if you can also speak to, like, in what we have previously thought of as the pathway one should take, one should hope for, does that still yield the same results?
What was the first question?
Oh, sorry. I realize these are like actually, why don't we just stick with the second question? We can come back to the funding one.
The funding one. Okay, I will start with Costa Brava. Costa Brava was a very ambitious film for a Lebanese feature, and especially a first feature. From the beginning, we conceived it as a dystopia. We wanted it's the story of a family that lives in the mountains that escaped Beirut's pollution, and it happens in the near future. And one day the government decides to build a huge landfill, and it's right in front of their house. And so we wanted from the beginning to really have this landfill on screen, and also there were moments of magical realism, etc. So all of this we knew would cost a lot of money. So from the beginning, me and the director knew that it was going to be a hard film to finance, so we wanted to put all to well surround ourselves so we can, finance it. At the time, we weren't really thinking about the distribution, but in the process of financing it, we found the right people to carry it with us and allowed it to be distributed. So it was a 6-way co-production. It was made with France, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, the US, and Norway. I think we raised financing from around 28 sources of financing. So it was a very international production, and which allowed later, when we finished it, there were so many people connected to that film, and each of these entities carried it somehow or pushed it in their territory, etc. So we managed to get this premiere. Also because I hope the film is good, not only because people around it, but it was really carried by the people who produced it or contributed to it. We went to several labs before that also to develop it. We knew it was going to be tough, so we really started very, very early on leading the path. Also we casted 2 Arab stars. One of them is Nadine Labaki, who's known internationally. So we really tried to have, like we had the international sales agent come on board earlier, the MENA, the Arab region distributor as well. And that was good for us because by the time the film was ready, it was COVID times and distribution was very, very tough. And distributors were not buying, like for local releases, theatrical releases were almost inexistent. So if we didn't have all these people on board before, I think the film would have not been seen and would have not been pushed. Then we had participants really advocate for a worldwide sale. The sale actually came for a regional buy only on Netflix for the Arab world, and it came through our MENA distributor, but because we had already discussed with all the partners saying, like, if any one of you gets a deal, try to make like a group and push for a global deal because this is what we want, and this is actually what happened. So that was what saved us for Costa Brava, and then it got mainly released in the countries of co-production, which forces you to have a distributor on board if they want to finance you. So, for example, in Sweden or Denmark or even France and Spain, so we had distributors because the financing imposed us to find a distributor on script stage. So that can also answer a little bit the financing from my end. I produce films in Lebanon, which has no public support. There's no funding. Also, there were some private investors, but not much anymore since the financial crisis of 2019. So I've always been somehow independent because I look for money from all around. Like I look in every possible way, every possible opportunity. I always gather pieces of financing from many different places, either grants, sometimes investors, but with smaller amounts, sales agents, minimum guarantees, co-production, etc. So that allows me to be a bit independent in the kind of stories I try to push. Of course, there is work to be done to have a package quite advanced and convincing to have people come on board. But then I didn't really feel like a change in a sense where financiers are telling me yes or no, but more that the financiers I sometimes go to suddenly don't want to finance anymore, and I have to find new ones to replace them, or they give less money than they used to give before, and I have to find this difference elsewhere. But in the core, things feel still as difficult before than now.
Yeah, my experience is the same. Like I don't have conversations in which I tell financiers, what would you want me to write so that you can finance it? You know, I write what I really want to make, and then I try to go and find them. And in the first film, it took me 8 years to find them. And I actually wrote it, you know, I lived here, I wrote it in English, even though I wanted to shoot it in Peru, this first film, Undertow, and I knocked doors here for 3 years. You know, it actually even it was a semi-finalist at the Nichols Fellowship. I got a lot of production companies writing me, they all read it, and they were like, we like it, but we cannot make it. It feels foreign. unless you change it into English and you shoot it in a place, because it has magic realism. You know, it has to be shot in a town where you would believe that people will bury their dead by throwing them into the ocean. You know, which I made up. That doesn't happen in Peru, but I made it up for the movie, and it works for the movie. And they were telling me, well, maybe if you do it in English with Javier Bardem and Penelope Cruz, we could think about it. But I don't, you know, in this fishing village, I don't see any of them as fishing people, you know. So I said no, and that's when I went to Europe. You know, and Berlin, and actually of all places, Germany was the first country to actually find money for the movie. And then France, and then Colombia, and finally Peru, which is where I'm from, which is where the movie was shot. The second film, and that movie, Undertow, it's very Latin American in the sense of what Europeans look at when they look at Latin American cinema. You know, it's in a small fishing village, which is very exotic. It's about a man who is married but has an affair with another man in a very traditional town, so it has social-political context, and it has magic realism. So it's Latin America in a bow, you know, for European financiers, and that's why it had money from Germany, from France, and it had distribution everywhere. It premiered in San Sebastián, which is a Spanish film festival, and then it went to Sundance. And Sundance actually won the Audience Award, and that's when the movie actually traveled around the US too. And it had distribution here. And we had a very unorthodox way of distributing, which I can talk about later. But the second film that I did is a psychological thriller, film noir, that I wrote thinking of LA, and it has a very cryptic ending, and I wanted it to stay that way. And I was afraid that if I find financing here, I was going to be forced to make a better, more clear ending. And also, I had a great experience shooting in Peru, so I decided to also do it in Peru. Europeans didn't want to touch it. It didn't. I mean, even when they saw the movie afterwards, we had no distribution in Europe because the comment was like, we like the movie, but it doesn't feel like it's Latin America. You know, so we actually it premiered in Toronto. We had distribution in some cities in the US. It went to HBO, and it had actually, because I think people didn't know what to do with it. And then my latest film, which is a comedy and a satire about upstairs, downstairs, we finished it right when the pandemic started. It had no theatrical distribution, but it was bought by Amazon because I invited one of the heads of production there to the Miami Film Festival, and she came and saw the movie and thought it could be a great TV series. And then bought the movie, and it's a movie that has made more money than any. And it never was screened in theaters, except for Peru.
Wow.
So, so I agree with what Myriam is saying, that financing comes in different ways, and it can be surprising when you actually make money and when you don't. My first movie was very well received, but it made less money than the last one, which pretty much people didn't see, So anyway, so I guess what I want to say is, write what you really want to write, and then go look for it. And it will take time, but if you really believe in it, and it took me 8 years to find money for the first one, and we lost the German money because I was taking so much time to get the rest. But then we got it back again. It was less, but we still got it back. So, I think that is the approach. Write what you really want to write, and then hopefully you can find people to believe in you.
All right. Investors, I know, sound so mysterious sometimes, like how, why, where are they hiding? But understand, like, high net worth individuals aren't just giving their money out. Like, you have to make a value proposition to them. A lot of times about investors, it's a listening exercise more than it's a talking exercise. I see a lot of filmmakers, they'll pitch everyone the same project the same way, but if they actually spent time to get to know the person they're speaking with, I put investors in kind of two buckets. The ROI investor, they want to know, when am I going to get my money? How am I going to get my money? In the marketplace now, they might not be your best potential benefactor. Just because you can raise money doesn't mean you should. Remember, we're all part of a very fragile ecosystem. So if you take money out of the system and you don't provide value, you've made it harder for the next person. So the ROI investor right now, maybe they're just doing tax credits. Keep them in that. The ROE investor is what I call return on experience. If you're listening to them, context clues, what they're interested in, now, 6 months later, 2 years later, 8 years later, hey, I remember you telling me about, you're really into penguins. I have this project. And they'll appreciate that you've taken that kind of more disciplined approach and you listen to what they're into. And finding investors, sometimes you just got to show up, going to the Sundances of the world, the Film Independent forums, the Cannes, the TIFF. The first time I went to Cannes, I was sleeping on a fold-out couch, but, I had to buy my first tux because you can't rent them for 2 weeks. But you just go to the places, and we were just having a good time. And after my first Cannes, from a woman I met from Australia, a company from Canada, and a guy from New York, I ended up raising $400,000 2 months later, which became my first Sundance film, The Lifeguard, in 2013. But you got to show up. So that's kind of a little bit about kind of the investors. Sometimes I say don't go to dollar beer night. Your potential investors aren't there. If you go to Cannes and you go to the nicest hotel in your town and you be interested and you be interesting, you never know what could happen. And on the investor side, on the studio side, is Javier Bardem in it? Is Glenn Powell or Sydney Sweeney in it? And they're all great, but that might not be what you're trying to make. So you have to show how can you deliver an audience. Distributors never ask you, how much did you make that for? I want to make sure you make a profit. They're almost like a pawn shop. I think I can make this off your film, therefore I'm going to discount it, get you there so I can make a profit margin. And I know that takes a little bit of the glamour out of filmmaking, but what I'm trying to do, and what I hope everyone in this room is trying to do, is trying to create a sustainable and viable career. So that patience and delivering value to the ultimate, customer goes a long way. And I think if you can show, you can find an audience. I did a film 10 years ago that people told me not to make for 6 years. It was one of the first films with a national release to star a person with Down syndrome. And historical numbers didn't show how that was going to play out, but I argued that there were 400,000 people in America with Down syndrome, and therefore 400,000 families and disability advocates. And that film ended up, called Where Hope Grows, ended up with over 500,000 Facebook fans, made $1.2 million in the box office, had a national release, and still to this day is making money. On My Friend Dahmer, we were like this. It was right before the true crime. I mean, we're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from AVOD because of the Netflix series 5 years later. If it was called My Friend Steve, the Future Serial Killer, it wouldn't have had the same impact. But this Dahmer, this awful human being, people have interest in that, and of course make what you want. But when I was able to say 6 of my previous 10 films sold for MGs higher than the budget, they all didn't sell for 10 million. One made for 200, sold for 260, made for 300, sold for 375, 400, and sold it for 600. So we were finding the right budget for it too. The amount of times I hear people, I need $2 million, and it's like, no, you don't. and in the $2 million, you're going to be a union film, which is great, but like a lot of money is going to go off screen. So I think it's like taking a disciplined approach both towards filmmaking and curating investors. But I try to give a little bit more, also practical stuff that if I can do it, anyone can do it.
I'd love to move this conversation into the festival perspective. So Ania, this question is for you. In this same realm of questioning, there was a time when a film would premiere at Sundance and it would automatically mean that it would get a big distribution deal. And I hope this is not horrible news to anyone in this room, but that is no longer the case all the time. Not never, but just not as consistently. And so I wonder from your perspective, firstly, do you feel from your end, is there pressure to select more commercial films in the hopes of getting these bigger deals and keeping the mechanisms of the industry running? And then also to something that you said earlier of like the joy of seeing people seeing a film together in an audience. Can you speak to the role of festivals if perhaps they are not as tied to big sales as they once were, and perhaps could be again?
I mean, I really think that it depends on the film, also the festival. I mean, Sundance is obviously one of many festivals out there that do that provide a platform for films. So we're not always the best fit for all the films, and that's also okay. I mean, of course, we want to have the best possible lineup, but we lose films to other festivals because sometimes Cannes is a better fit, or Josh will prefer to go to Toronto for whatever reason. So it just depends on the scenario, depends on the film. But did you just say unlikely?
Never. No, we love Toronto, but yeah, Sundance is for documentaries, I think, is acknowledged as the best place to sell a documentary.
Pandering.
There are great other opportunities, and no one would argue with that. You wouldn't argue with that.
No, and I actually agree with this from the perspective of someone who used to buy and sell too, that this was my best experience. But I do think that filmmakers, I mean, I always appreciate when people don't get fixated on just like there's just one route, and this is the only option for you. I mean, it's great to have plan A, but also B and C and D, because of what if something goes wrong? For whatever reason, you might just simply not be ready to submit to us on time. And that's also okay. So but back to your question about sort of like the commercial aspect of things, to me, it's also just sort of the role of our festival is to encourage people to see these films slightly differently. So whatever you consider a commercial film might not be quite what we show, but the fact that we'll make it interesting, or there will be a balance to how we program, because that's kind of the most important thing for me. Let's try and find something that works for different types of people. And even the way that the team works, we're one of the few festivals I feel like that has a team that works across the board. So I specialize in nonfiction, but I'll also be watching fiction films toward the end, and we all decide together, which makes we are very different, sort of like diverse group, I would say, and we have very different opinions about films. And that's what makes it interesting. And I think we try to find something that will work for different audiences. And when you think about a film that sold really well out of Sundance this year, A Real Pain, Jesse Eisenberg film, sure you can like, oh, of course, but it's Jesse. It's a film about two cousins going to Poland to search their grandma's roots and all of that. And so part of it is about dealing with grief and trauma. So it's not exactly like your blockbuster type. And that sold really well, and that was also because people had a very emotional response to that film. And this is what it did to us as curators. And that's not always a given if you watch 6 to 8 films a day for weeks, that you have an emotional response to anything. So the fact that it worked was really big. But that's how I look at these types of films. Let's make them feel a little bit more accessible or commercial at times. And then we have space for films. Like, I don't know, one of my favorites from the last few years, Smokes on a Sisterhood, which is, it's an art house documentary from Estonia. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, but it's a tough film to sell, and that's also okay because we have room for these films. And so I think that I just kind of, I don't know, I struggle with this whole thing of what's commercial, what isn't commercial, because if we believe in what's being presented to us by streamers, as in like, well, you might like this. I was like, why? What made you think that I would like this? There's nothing about this that appeals to me, but there's an algorithm, and I get that. But again, looking for examples at this year's festival, Daughters, an incredible documentary, but again about how faulty the prison system in this country is. And it's not your typical kind of film that you would think will do so well, but audiences responded to it, and it's beautiful to see. So I think it's just, it's finding balance in everything. And I think also for like making something to, again, back to that whole thing of understanding what you're trying to do and what your goal would be. And are you okay with the film being on a streaming platform and not traveling with it this time? And yeah, like, to Javier's point, that could be incredibly successful too. So it just depends on what your priorities are, I guess.
And to continue this line of questioning now, I feel like we should have sat in order of the process of the filmmaking, starting with production and then ending with distribution with Josh at the end. So this question is for you, Josh. So in this scenario that a film gets into a prestige film festival and in the market that we are currently in is not immediately picked up, what do you advise for filmmakers? How long do they wait? Do you think the marketplace, is this just a moment of softness? Do you think it will come back? What does the filmmaker who does have a film with great festivals, what should they do if a big streamer is not immediately buying?
So that's something that, of course, that as a sales company and a production company, we deal with, with every title. It's an evaluation process with each film in a different way because every film is different. And so if a film is going to Sundance, part of the reason I say Sundance is the best opportunity to sell is partly also because of the timing, because it's the first month of the year and the budgets are fresh and people are ready after a holiday vacation want to come back and start getting back into business. I think if Sundance was in June, it may not be the same thing. So, we've had amazing experiences with many other festivals, and it also depends on when your film is finished and when it's available. If you're just finishing up in, let's say April or May, you may not want to wait all the way until the following year. And so you sometimes go and seek out festivals that are in the fall, like Telluride and Venice and Toronto, et cetera. But if you have a film, and we had a number of films at Sundance, including Daughters and Sugarcane, and some of them were bigger sales. So there was, we felt like there was an uptick from the previous year, which was a little more challenging, and there was only one or two bigger sales. But I think it goes back to evaluate every film, and as a sales company, we get on the same page with our team. When we worked on Black Barbie, we outlined a strategy and said, this is how we launched at South by Southwest, and we sort of always say, we don't know. Sometimes it can happen really quickly, and it could be a big sale, and sometimes it takes a lot longer. I would say right now, almost everything is taking longer, and part of it is that, in my own instinctual sense, is that the market is sort of waiting for the next cycle to turn into the next year. I talked to all the buyers, and I talked to producers and financiers, and there's just an overall feeling like we sort of are in this frozen zone, maybe partially influenced by waiting to see what happens at the election, waiting to see if there's another insurrection on January 6th. The turmoil of our country is obviously underlying everyone's psyche. And so I think you go to buyers and, they often will say, we're full up. And so if this film, if you wanted to wait 2 years, we have a slot in 2 years, most films would probably say yes to that, honestly, these days. But in a way, it's sort of a way of passing, because if there is something that these buyers absolutely love and they want, they will miraculously find space for it. And we've seen that happen over and over again. But it is a way of kind of saying, what they're really saying is they're just waiting for that thing that's the best thing they could possibly imagine that they, and that's the hard part, is that not everything can be a triple A plus. Sometimes if a film is a B plus, speaking broadly, that's a great film. Now these days it feels like buyers are kind of just waiting for that thing that's a little better, and it sometimes never comes. And so they're commissioning films, and then those films are not guaranteed to turn out. So you go to a festival and you see a great film, you see audience, like Daughters is a great example, where it was all about the emotional response in that room. Any buyer who was in the room when Daughters premiered could not resist, because it was a devastatingly emotional experience with all the families and the kids, and it was just incredible. And so you kind of know, okay, the film is great, we've seen people respond to it, that's a little bit of an insurance policy. If you commission something, and making films is hard. You don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. Like Ania said, some of the screeners might say, here, we have this great film, and your reaction might be like, why would you think we'd be interested in that? Because there's no guarantee. So it's interesting. The whole landscape feels very filled with turmoil and unpredictability, But I come back to the positive note that what we see over and over again is that real quality, even if it is on a more moderate level of accessibility, still stands out, still will find a home. Even like another example is All That Breathes the year before. That film, I mean, to be totally honest, it was somewhat dead in the water after Sundance. It took 2 or 3 months with a lot of insistent pushing with HBO, who ended up buying it, and they were, in the end, they were so happy that they did, of course, because it was nominated, and our company released it theatrically. It had a good theatrical run. But, so part of it is like, what is that? It's like you're putting on a show. Let's put on a show. Putting on the show is like figuring out how to get the film out there in a creative way, and that's what everyone is going to have to do these days. And there is often a positive ending to that, but it's not always easy.
That's a perfect introduction to my next question, and I will make this the last moderated question, then we can open it up to the audience. But this question is for all of you. And something I think about a lot, which connects to something, Josh, that you just said, is like, as we are entering award season and we see these lists of films, of predictions of what will make it, so many of them today say, still seeking US distribution. And I know we're international, that was my American slip, still seeking distribution. And I think that's very interesting because it's like, what does distribution mean? And I think about that a lot. And to give another example, an exemplary film of last year, To Kill a Tiger, didn't have distribution until Netflix bought it. And I wonder, as we sit here, and also connecting to something Myriam you had said as a producer, you are no longer able to simply finish the film and then move on to the next project. You are pulled more and more into the process of doing festivals and managing the distribution pieces. And so my question to each of you is, in this moment of filmmaking, what to you is good distribution? Sorry to make you don't have to go first.
I could. Actually, yeah, for me, again, I'm not American, and I know here the market is different, but coming from a very small country with very small representation, for me, distribution is when the film gets seen by as many people possible. So sometimes when I see it struggling to be bought or making money, I still want to push it to be seen as much as possible, even if it's on free platforms or even if it's in curated screenings or educational or whatever. So for me, this is distribution. Especially when I give up the idea that I'm gonna make profits from it, and I consider already the fact that it exists and it was made and people got paid to make it is somehow of a miracle. Because also the movies I produced, most of them, all of them maybe, were very politically engaged, and they carry a message, they carry a documentation of that part of the world. I believe me and the filmmakers I produced, we made films for history, not only for the moment where they will screen, but that I want them to remain and stay alive for years and years to come. And I think my biggest pride today is one of my older films get screened somewhere or gets bought again, or it's always, I feel immensely proud that these films are still alive. So somehow for me, that's successful distribution. Even if it's in the commercial aspect, it's not really an answer to people who really want to make money out of this industry.
Yeah, I feel the same. I grew up watching films in theaters, so of course that is a dream as a filmmaker, and you actually work, at least I do, when I frame, when I'm doing color correction, when I'm doing sound mixing, I'm not thinking of a phone, as a filmmaker, I'm thinking of a big theater. So of course, that is a dream, and I've been lucky that happened, especially with my first film. It didn't happen with the last one. But I agree that in the end, it's you work on a story and for so long that you want to share it, especially everything I've made in film, like the TV series that I did, I was invited to do them, and I believed in them, but they didn't come out of me. So I wanted them to be good, but my films are really me. So I want, and they talk about important things to me politically, but also socially, and so I want them to be seen, and I want to have people, and I'm proud of them. Like it's not, I don't cringe when I see them, thankfully, So I want to share them with people, That's why I did that shameless plug at the beginning. But at the same time, you have to come to terms with what that film is going to be able to achieve. So in my first film, because it's a love story it's a love triangle, but there's like two men, so it has a queer component. But it's also shot in Peru and Latin America, so it has a Latino component. And there's pretty much a gay or a Latino film festival every city in the world. So it went everywhere because it made sense everywhere in terms of festivals. And it was great to show it, and I went and I took the time to go with it a lot, And festivals actually, well, I don't know if that's still the case, but some festivals, especially if they're not Sundance or Venice or Toronto or Berlin, they will pay a fee to have your film there. So we actually, and this company here in the US, Film Collaborative, which are great, they are the ones who are handling the festivals. And they said 50% of that we'll keep, and the other 50% we can actually invest in creating a little rollout distribution of your film in the US. So we had like 4 prints, and we started with San Francisco, which made sense, and then LA and New York, and then Miami, and then, and so then we had the New York Times, the LA Times, everybody writing a review, because you only get reviews if you are in theatrical distribution, at least at that time, and those are the reviews that people really want to put, So it was a very creative way of not spending money. It's using the money of festivals to finance the distribution. I don't know if that can be done now. This was 2010, but I think that if you talk to theaters, and they are really interested, you might find a way to do that. The last film came out during the pandemic. There was no way to do any of that. So I was lucky, but at the same time, I learned with my first film to knock every single door, even if you think it doesn't make sense. Even if it's a waste of energy, it never is, So I totally agree with the comment of go to Berlin and crash in somebody's place and go to the market, get yourself a badge, and introduce yourself to people. You never know who, when they remember your face, oh, you were the guy, you were the woman. It makes a big difference. So that's why I invited this executive that I knew at Amazon to come see it, and I was surprised that vaccines were just coming out. I thought she was going to say, send me a link. But she came, and she loved the movie, and she saw it with, a small audience, because there were 1 person, 3 blocked seats, another person, this was the Miami Film Festival, and she bought the movie with the hopes of making it into a TV series, which hasn't happened yet. That's a whole story. But it made the movie. It's a movie that actually paid itself quicker, and it was in some festivals, and it had no theatrical distribution. But I loved the fact that people can see it, and she bought it only for Latin America, and then HBO bought it for the US. So I'm happy that people can get to see it. Of course, in a theater, when you are there, it's wonderful to see the reaction, but that happens. Anyway, long story short, I agree with distribution is, if you can make your money back, at least make your money back, and then have the experience, because I also make films for the experience of making. The journey is really important to me, and that's why I want to work with people that I like, and that doesn't only mean in the production or in the cast, it means, and I've had bad luck with sales agents. Like the first sales agents that we had, I'm not going to mention them, but they might as well be selling tires. They really don't love cinema. and we didn't do very good research because they had been the sales agent of a very successful film from Chile that was nominated for the Oscars, and we were like, oh my God, of course. Well, actually, it wasn't the sales agent who did that. It was the American distributor who got that. They were nominated for the Golden Globe, not for the Oscars, and it was the American distributor. So we didn't do a good research, and I remember meeting with one of them and not getting a good vibe, but you know, they got this Chilean film to the Golden Globe, so let's go with them. And it was a really, and I'm glad that they didn't do the festivals. I'm glad that it was the Film Collaborative who did, you know. Anyway, so that's it.
Well, I was just thinking about how this brings me back to this whole, you know, two things. One is do your research, always, and that goes for distribution as well. But also there's like no one way to do things, even if people tell you that there is. And this is where, again, I would say that with distribution as well, I think I kind of warmed up to the idea of filmmakers doing like self-distribution these days. I think I was very, very skeptical of it before because it's so much work and it's so hard. But on the other hand, if you get the right team with, you know, someone to help you and someone who actually knows what they're doing and they will have access to the right people in terms of theaters and the right theaters as well, there will be the right audience for your film. It's doable and it can be a lot of fun too and it can make you money. It's just that it's hard. And I used to be so much more skeptical of it. And I think now, just don't get fixated on, you know, A24 distributing your film because that's not going to happen to everybody and that's okay. And they might not be the best one for you either. So it's just, I think it's just, again, and to Javier, to your point, like talking to people who are your friends in the industry and had experiences with other people in this field and knowing how good of a job they did with something, but also be critical of that too, like have a little bit of sort of ask the right questions too. It's like, what was it that made it into a bad experience? Because I think sometimes expectations can have a lot to do with that, and having unrealistic expectations can be a factor in all of this too. So I think it's important to think about that.
Your opening question where you said To Kill a Tiger as an example, and you said until Netflix bought it, I would just like to rephrase that to say when Submarine sold it
Sorry.
to Netflix.
Submarine sold it to Netflix, yes.
But because that was quite a ride. It was a really interesting, it's a case study that, you know, there's not enough time on this panel left to go into, but it's a good example of what I view as good distribution, which is like, that was a really great example of something that worked out beyond our, you know, expectations, and it's all about exactly what you said. That's how, when we sign films, it's all about getting on the same page. And so that, as I was talking about earlier, the evaluation process is not just purely do we love the film and do we believe that it can be sold, but it's also what are the expectations of the team, what is the financial pressure. The thing that we'll walk away from more quickly than anything else is like, I hope you can sell this because I mortgaged my house for it. And that, we do hear that, and it's like, I hate hearing that because that's not a good idea. I mean, look, it could end really well for you, but it might not. But anyway, so we have more than usual like political films going into this political season. We have Errol Morris's film Separated, this film Steve Pink directed called The Last Republican, a film called The White House Effect from Bonnie Cohen and John Schenk. And so the idea of what good distribution is for some of those films is we want to get out within this period, not necessarily before the election, which may not be realistic, but in this period when it can be part of the conversation, which I think is going to extend at least until January 20th. So those films might be very happy and feel like they got the distribution they wanted, even if it isn't the biggest deal. And of course, other films are under way more financial pressure from their investors, and we have to, as a sales company, we have to understand what that is and feel that we can deal with it, and personalities matter and everything that goes into it. So I think we're always looking to get on the same page. And the last thing I'll say is that, of course, we work on a commission basis. So if someone chooses to take a smaller deal because that's what's right for the film, we support it 100%. And of course, we're going to make less too, but that's what good distribution looked like for that film. So it's all about, at least for us, making sure that we're fulfilling the reality of what everyone wanted going in.
Yeah, I think all great answers, and I hope I don't start with a bad one. Like, you know, who is your audience is a question you can't ask soon enough, and what is success? So like, and who is your audience? You know, studios they because they need to make $1 billion, they have to do the 4-quadrant approach. You know, men, women, you know, old, young, but for what we're doing, often it's about, you know, nailing your niche. I never know how to say that word. You know, movies like Moonlight and Parasite, they're just so good at what they're trying to do for their audience. Well, then it crosses over and becomes a big success. And I think a lot of people, because most of what we see is the stuff that's heavily marketed, is the 4-quadrant approach. And if you make a movie for everyone, you make it for no one. And if you create that conversation with that audience early, and you know, social media, as we know, can be an awful place, but it can be a wonderful place too. You know, Black Barbie, I found on Twitter, June 2020, people are like, how come no one's ever made this movie? And I was like, that's a good question. And I'd never made a doc before, but it was COVID. I was like, docs are less people, therefore safer. Maybe I'll do a doc. And I DM'd Ligeria. She'd been doing, you know, now everybody's like, of course, it makes so much sense. She'd been doing labs for 8.5 years of people saying you should make this and never funding it. And I worked on some of the materials with her, send it to friends of mine, and they fully financed it. Never met her till the day we premiered at South by in person, but it's like I understood, she understood the audience and the conversation we had on social media. You know, I always challenge other filmmakers, like, how many times are you purchasing another indie film ticket in a theater on iTunes? And if you're not doing that, and then you're expecting people to watch your films, like what I talked about, the fragile ecosystem, like we need to do what we can to support each other before we ask for, you know, help. You know, this film that came to me several years ago, the filmmakers, they'd been rejected from Sundance, South by, and Tribeca, and they came to me and said, help. And I was like, what do you want me to do? And I watched the film, and I was like, this is an important film. I was like, take 5 minutes out, and there was a 911 operator in the movie. I was like, who's that? They're like, oh, it was our friend. And I was like, that's a real character. Voice acting is acting, you know? And I called my friend Anika Noni Rose, who's the voice of the first Black Disney princess, a real voice actor, just a fantastic actor, period. And they took out 5 minutes, added her, and they were like, this is so much better. Let's go for Sundance again. I was like, we're going to get rejected again. There's a great fall film festival circuit, and we got into the Austin Film Festival, and we won the jury prize and audience prize. And I sat down with the investors that night, and I was like, what's your goals? They're like, we want to sell it. I was like, no one's going to buy it. That's not good enough. I was like, give me some time if I can help find an executive producer to help amplify the message. You know, To Kill a Tiger is a great example. There was like 45 people amplifying the message, and it took me like 3 months, but I was able to bring in Morgan Freeman, and you know, that little film made for less than $300,000 that was rejected from all the major festivals, sold for an MG higher than the budget, got nominated for 3 Spirit Awards, and you know, I was never on set one day, so make sure someone on your team knows how to talk to the audience, whether that audience is a film festival, whether that audience is a distributor, a sales agent. Like, you do not have a complete team if it's just like, none of it's rocket science. It's just experience and relationships. And you know, the audiences are actually, you're thinking about the end user in the theater or at home. Your first audiences are going to be the film festivals and the distributor, and you know, make films accordingly.
Wonderful, rich material for our conversation. So thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to everyone for coming. Yes, let's have a little optimism for the future.
Thank you.